I'm Ryan. Ben Shapiro has opinions on transgender people.
I'm Ryan. We'll discuss whether he's drunk or sober when we return to beer and politics.
You know, Betty White really is the greatest Golden Girl. Choosy parents choose Jif. He's so mean. He really is. Hey Ryan, are we out of partisan again?
Welcome to another episode of Beer and Politics. We are your superfluous hosts, Ryan and Ryan. Today we are going to be discussing, again, transgender issues and Ben Shapiro, thanks to KrazyReader. Now, KrazyReader, we had a long comment section on our last video. You should check it out. Brought up some points that we thought needed addressing. But before we begin, of course, as always, Madam Brewmaster, what are we drinking today?
Today we're drinking Magic Hat number 9.
Now, Magic Hat number 9, this is an ale. They actually call it a not-so-pale ale. It is also brewed with apricot. We're flavoring at least 5.5% alcohol and 20 IBUs. What do you think?
You better like apricot. I like it a lot. It's very fruity, but it definitely tastes like a lot of apricot. But it's nice. I had this many times, and I like it.
I'm going to agree. It's something that would be really good for a warm day, a summer's day. I actually think it would pair nicely with like a charcuterie plate. Something that's got like a nice mild cheese or something.
Or an apricot pie.
Or yeah, that would work too.
If they exist.
They can. Challenge accepted.
All right. So, thank you, Magic Hat number 9. Again, they did not endorse this. They did not sponsor this. They probably don't even want us talking about it. But we did, and we thank you for the delicious beer.
Cheers.
Cheers. So, KrazyReader, we had a back and forth conversation. They said, listen, guys, you got this wrong. You're missing Ben Shapiro's main point. And that main point is that transgender people are mentally ill. And that's not Ben Shapiro's main point. I'm actually going to correct KrazyReader here. Ben Shapiro's main point, I suppose, if we're going to go that route, is that transgender people are mentally ill and that we should treat them differently than the way they would prefer to be treated. All right, we're going to look at his qualifications as a psychologist a little bit later.
Plenty of time.
That's
Trust
right.
us.
So, but till then, let's talk about why he thinks it's a mental illness. And he really has two kind of pillars that he's building this argument on. The first one is a word pillar. And we tackled this. That's why I wouldn't say we missed the point. We just tackled it differently than KrazyReader would have liked, which is Ben Shapiro needs both sex and gender to mean the same thing and be the same thing. That way, if you're trying to change your sex or gender, you are delusional because you can't do that, right? So we talked about this ad nauseum in our previous videos, you should check them out, where we identified that gender and sex are indeed not the same thing, hence we have two different words for them. And we believe it's possible to actually change your gender because it is a social construct. And so if you are a person who wants to transition their gender, then you could do that without necessarily being mentally ill. Now, transitioning your sex, that's something else. So if you're a transsexual, we don't think you can actually change your sex. But we don't think that either transgenders or transsexuals believe that they're changing their biology.
Correct.
Right? They're just trying to get to a point with their anatomy that matches how they identify on the inside with their gender. And I don't think they're delusional. I think they understand the reality of their circumstances. All right, number 2, the second pillar is suicidality, which is just fun to say in a sad way, but I never get to say it. Thanks to Ben Shapiro, it's a new word in my lexicon. So the suicidality of transgender people, which is to say that transgender people have a higher suicide rate than the general public. And he's right. Now, the problem that we think he's running into, and purposefully so, is the relationship between causation and correlation. And Ryan is going to help us out here.
So correlation is the relationship of two or more things to each other, whereas causation is one thing leading directly to another. So A causes B. And almost any time we're talking about statistics, we're talking about correlation. In single instances, we can talk about causation. Now, I'm going to even stick in the realm of suicide here and point out a statistic. We know that if you have a gun in your home, you are more likely to commit suicide. You're more likely to commit suicide. That would be a correlation. Now, if you do, unfortunately, commit suicide and there was a gun in your home, the gun did not cause you to commit suicide. This was not the underlying reason for the action. It's a difference between correlation and causation.
Right, so Ben Shapiro is treating, well, actually we're treating being transgender like the gun, meaning that being transgender isn't necessarily what causes the suicide.
Correct.
Ben Shapiro is saying it is the cause. And so luckily for us, we get to look at the data that he's using to substantiate that claim. And he's largely using a study from the Williams Institute where they looked at data from the National Transgender Discrimination Survey. All right, and it's online, you can look it up. All of the data's there, all of their reasoning's there, all the rationale's there. And we in fact did that, and this is what we found. Ben Shapiro is too smart to have accidentally said what he said. We think he is purposefully lying to his supporters, well, and everyone else in general. He is omitting information or context that is being provided in the survey. He's creating conclusions that shouldn't be created per the context that they've given, and he's creating context where there was none to justify his point. So what we're going to do now is we're going to look at the actual statements he makes from his video, and we're going to let you know what he omitted and what he fabricated.
Let's take a listen.
We all just want to be loved and accepted by others. That's all any transgender child wants, to be loved and accepted fully by their parents. Now, the idea behind this kind of garbage is that gender is completely a societal construct, and if you want to save your transgender child, all you have to do is tolerate and, of course, make sure that your kid has hormone therapy at 11 and transgender surgery at 15 or 16 years old. Here's what transgender kids actually need: proper therapy and treatment. But this is what happens when a society begins to accept the crap pseudoscience of transgenderism. Kids suffer, and they suffer at the hands of their parents. Corey is not going to be cured of maleness through prepubescent hormone treatments and therapy. Here's the stats, okay? Just 4.6% of Americans altogether attempt suicide. 41% of transgender people do. According to the Williams Institute at UCLA and the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, quote, prevalence of suicide attempts is elevated among those who disclose to everyone that they are transgender or gender nonconforming. 50% of people who tell all their friends that they're transgender try to commit suicide at some point. 45% of transgender people who have undergone hormone therapy try suicide. So it turns out that only 41% of transgenders try suicide. That number goes up if you have hormone therapy. The same is true for people who undergo any form of surgery. Actually, suicide rates are the lowest among transgender people who don't want any form of treatment. And as for this ridiculous notion that it's because society is mean that transgender people commit suicide, this too is garbage. It's nonsense. The reason that transgender people try to commit suicide is because they suffer from a horrible mental illness, and you have to feel horrible for them. Here's what the stats show. For transgender people who say they occasionally are identified as transgendered by others, in other words, they're walking around and somebody says, you're not really a woman, you're a dude, 41% have attempted suicide. And that's only for those who are operating occasionally. Among those who say that they are never identified as transgender, never, ever, meaning that they live their entire life and nobody really cares whether they're transgender or not, 36% of them try to commit suicide. In other words, transgenderism, it's a mental disorder. It's not the fault of a societal construct. The only real societal construct is the stupid, idiotic, ascientific, anti-evidentiary notion that biological sex and gender are totally separate and independent. They aren't.
All right, so what we find out here is that this study has a lot of limitations. The authors, by the way, are very upfront about this. It's actually the first thing in the study. Ben Shapiro had to read through the limitations in order to get to the part of the data. So to think he just overlooked this is ludicrous. Basically, one of the big limitations of the study that the authors say is this is a study of convenience. And what that means is that people were handed pieces of paper that they could fill out at their leisure. They could mail them back in. They could take this survey online. They were given no direction by anyone who was taking the data. So the people who were involved in collecting the data and analyzing the data had nothing to do with the people providing the data. This is a limitation. One of the other things is that this is a study that focused on discrimination, meaning the authors said, if you have been discriminated against, you're probably more likely to fill out the study and send it back in because it is about this experience. Very much like when you have a bad experience at a restaurant, you leave a negative Yelp review. People like to tell you about that stuff. Lastly, and this may be the biggest one, that there was a single question about suicide asked. And that question was, have you ever in your lifetime attempted suicide? And this is really important here because what we find is that when that question is asked, not in an interview scenario where there's someone who can follow up and kind of drill down, we find that that number gets inflated. And what happens is people don't really understand the question or how to respond to it. They say, maybe I've really considered suicide, so I mark yes. Or maybe I kind of cut myself or burned myself for attention, so they answer yes. And what research finds is that when that one question is asked, with no context provided, we can get inflated numbers of up to 40%. 40%, which would put that number of 41% down to around 25%, which is getting really close to the LGBTQ community, which has attempted rates of around 20%.
Yep.
And what all of this together really means here is, and the authors say this may not be representative of the transgender community as a whole.
And just to drive your point home, this is all at the very beginning of the study?
The very beginning.
Under a section called limitations?
Yes.
Ah, very good. All right. So the next thing he points out for us is that coming out to your friends, the people who came out to their friends actually had a higher rate of attempted suicide than the average in the study. And so what he's saying is that clearly coming out to your friends doesn't address your mental illness because you're coming out to people who are accepting of you. Right? And so that should make you feel better, and you shouldn't want to commit suicide or attempt suicide after doing so. What he omitted here is acceptance. What he told you is that these people were accepting you. What we found, and it's in the study, that largely their friends didn't accept them when they came out to their friends. Their families didn't accept them. The court system actually kept them from seeing their children when they came out. And they said, this is one of the reasons that I attempted suicide. And let me ask you, if you, this is a rhetorical question because I can't hear you on the other side of the camera, or on the other side of the podcast, if you had everyone you love and care about say, I don't love and care about you, so your friends don't care about you, your family doesn't care about you, you can't see your children, you can't hold or get a job because transgender people are not a protected class, you get kicked out of your home, you can't get a home. If all that happened to you, might your mental well-being be impacted in a negative way?
Only if your environment plays any role in your health.
And luckily here at Beer and Politics, our environment does not impact us at all.
Not at all. We are perfect.
All right.
One of the things, excuse me, one of the things he talks about here, he says, the rates of attempted suicide go up if you have had hormonal therapy, if you've attempted or undergone any kind of surgery, and the rates of suicide are actually, or attempted suicide, are actually lowest among those people who never underwent any of these treatments. And the assertion here is that these treatments not only don't work, but have a negative effect on the person.
Right.
And what he omits here entirely is timing. It's the timeline. Now, if you don't feel good about yourself to the point where you are willing to take hormones, or you're willing to undergo surgery to change the way you appear, it would stand to reason that maybe you're not as happy with yourself as someone who doesn't want to do either of those things. And this is important because timing, again, maybe you attempted suicide and then it didn't work out, or you decided you wanted to go on after all and thought, you know what, I'm going to get myself right, and I'm going to do these things that will help me live a better life. But he omits timing, and the conclusion he draws and he wants you to draw is that causation of therapy to suicide.
That's right. And we're going to do a little exercise for you. Ryan, that's him, not me, he will be our survey respondent.
I will.
So we're going to do an exercise where he fills out a very similar survey that was filled out here. So my one survey question that I'm going to ask is, Ryan, have you ever on a daily basis pooped in your pants?
Absolutely. I was an infant before.
Okay. Did you seek treatment or therapy for that? We might call that potty training.
I did.
Okay. Ryan, are you an adult male in your 30s?
I am.
Okay, so if I asked other adult males if, let's say 100 of them,
Okay.
if they have ever pooped in their pants on a daily basis and if they sought therapy or also known as potty training, would you say at least 99 out of 100 would say yes to that?
I would.
Okay, so if you're Ben Shapiro, what's the conclusion you draw?
If I'm Ben Shapiro, I draw the conclusion that we have an epidemic of adult males shitting in their pants on a daily basis, even though they've received therapy.
That's right, you do draw that conclusion. But that's only because we left out two important questions. One would be, when was the last time you pooped in your pants? And the other one would be, after you got treatment, did you stop pooping in your pants?
Good
Yeah.
questions. They
Yeah.
provide a lot of context for the situation.
Yep, so moving on, he asserts that there are people who occasionally or never are recognized as being transgender and that their suicide rates or attempted suicide rates are still high. So clearly fitting in or blending in doesn't impact your rate of suicide attempts. And what did he leave out? We'll see this over and over again. The study points it out very clearly at the beginning. He omitted timing. We are to presume, I suppose, that these people, from the day that they figured out, identified, decided, accepted that they are transgender, went out into the world and nobody could tell that they were transgender. They just blended in.
They didn't have to explain themselves to anyone.
Yeah, that they were not discriminated against. They just blended in. And therefore, after they blended in, they were still sad and they attempted suicide. We aren't to believe that maybe there was a transition period. I wish I knew what the trans and transgender stood for. We're not to believe that. So he left out timing again, and he's going to continue this. And it's, again, very important in this study because they only ask if ever in your life did it happen, not when, not how many times.
All right, ever. One of the other big things that he leaves out entirely is disability. What we find in the study is that 50% of the respondents who said they attempted suicide also said they suffered from a disability, either mental or physical, so severe that it kept them from major living activities. Now, a major living activity is something like breathing, walking, communicating with people. And we know that if in general, not even among transgender people, but among the general populace, if you suffer from a disability that keeps you from performing a major living activity, you are far more likely to attempt suicide.
That's a strong correlation, huh?
It is a very strong correlation.
Yeah.
But that's something that you might want to know.
Yep, and he leaves that out. He fabricates everything. It's hard.
It is.
It's hard. Because we like him a lot, because he speaks very clearly, very quickly, very precisely, seems knowledgeable, very authoritarian. Authoritative.
Authoritative.
Maybe both. So the last thing I'm going to talk about with regards to these is, and so this is a point he doesn't make, and this is something he omits entirely, and it's my favorite statistic in the study. All right? I'm going to present it in the way that Ben Shapiro would present it. So let's all erase our brains. We don't know anything about transgender suicide rates. We don't know anything about the demographics. And now, give me a moment. Here's Ben Shapiro. I want to talk to you all today about a serious issue we have in the transgender community. Transgender suicide rates are alarmingly high. They need more money. That's the cure. I know this because I saw a study. Turns out if they make less than $10,000 in annual income, they are 56% likely to have attempted suicide. And we see that the more money they make, the attempted suicide rate decreases to the point that by the time they make over $100,000, it's down to 26%. Clearly the issue here is not mental illness, Ryan. It's money.
Kind of a silly argument, though, isn't it?
Yeah, it sounds silly. I think it sounds silly, right?
I do.
We should just throw money at them. That'll cure the problems.
Right.
Right. And everyone out there and everyone listening would say, yeah, that sounds silly. Even though the way I presented it is exactly the way he presents all of his data. He draws conclusions that the authors of the study say don't do.
Yep. And one thing he also does in the talking points is he compares the black community to the transgender community for the purpose of, really correlation. He says, apparently we live in a society where black people are bullied, and what we don't see is high levels of suicide. So, transgender people being bullied, obviously that's not the cause. Now, I'm going to argue that we don't say, or liberals, or don't say all the time that black people are bullied.
Right.
They would say that they're discriminated against. It's very different. No one says there's systemic bullying. It's systemic racism or systemic discrimination. But again, you got to muddy those waters to make your point. And he says, okay, if you look at the black community overall, their suicide rates are very low. What he leaves out is among transgender people, the rate of suicide attempts for black people is among the highest.
He does. So clearly, discrimination or even bullying among race is not the same as discrimination or bullying among sexual orientation.
Might even
whatever that would actually technically be called.
We might even say that gender identity and race aren't the same thing.
What? Get out of town.
We would.
They're not the same. Ben would say they are. I guess.
Or at least they're close enough to apples and apples that we can compare them.
All right. Well, stick around for our cold-filtered, barrel-aged words of wisdom when we return. And welcome back to Beer and Politics. In this section, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about, me specifically, I want to talk to some of the points that I discussed with KrazyReader. And Ryan's going to drive home some points that we think really wraps this all up. We call this our cold-filtered, barrel-aged words of wisdom. So in my discussions with KrazyReader, KrazyReader pointed out, or tried to point out at the very least, that the LGBTQ community is largely accepted now, or is more so accepted than they were 5 or 10 years ago, which, yeah, of course I say of course, but I would think that they're more accepted now, but
I would agree.
Largely feels like we're overstepping this a little bit. That seems a little bit exaggerated to me. One of the reasons that KrazyReader said that was because the Democratic Party somehow endorsed the community or accepted them. I would argue that a political party saying something does not demonstrate largely a community of 300 million accepting them.
Yes.
I feel like that might be pandering to some extent. Okay, so I'm going to throw that aside. But I am going to talk to the other point they made, which was that there are clubs and organizations within schools for the LGBTQ community. And KrazyReader would say that demonstrates a larger acceptance in our society. And I would actually say that it demonstrates that we're still far from accepting them in our society, because the only reason those clubs would exist or need to exist is because we don't accept them. They need the support, right?
Yeah.
We don't have a white guy who likes chicks club unless you're talking about the Ku Klux Klan. I don't think they do that in school.
We're just the guys that subscribe to Playboy.
Right, exactly. We're the de facto of what people expect, and so therefore we don't need a club. They need a club because they do need that support. One of the things I want to point out, though, is this idea that the LGBTQ community is like, if you will, the white community or the black community or any other community, because they're not. You know, their support is necessary. Their acceptance is necessary, but they're not like us because they have an acronym that denotes very specific groups of people. And while they all support each other, those letters in that acronym may not actually understand each other.
They may have similar goals, similar things. Like, we suffer a similar oppression, perhaps,
right?
And so we kind of, group together.
But there's more than just acceptance when we're talking about discrimination and bullying and that kind of thing. Because what we're talking about is, so I'm a white guy, and when I see another white guy, I don't only just accept him. I actually understand his situation. We actually grew up in the same town, in the same socioeconomic class, and we're both white. So when he says, listen, I went through this today. Do you understand? Or I felt this way today. I say, yes, I understand. But in the LGBTQ community, you don't necessarily get that. I don't actually know what it means to feel like you are another gender or another sex. I wouldn't say I necessarily feel like a man. I wouldn't be able to describe what feeling like a man or a male is. The only thing I could do is say, you see all those people out there? Those people who look like me, I think I act like them. And I feel like they understand my situation and they accept me, and we go through the same common thing. And when I describe my feelings, they would say, oh, I feel the same way. But other than that, I can't really tell you, other than we've seen gender roles in our society, and that's how I know what a man is, because of the gender roles that exist today. And we're talking about transgender, so that's That's something to be said here because they see gender roles and they don't understand them. They don't feel that way. And I even asked some of my gay friends, I understand it's anecdotal, I know it's not statistically significant, but I said, you're part of this LGBTQ community where everyone says, see, we're accepting, you understand each other. And I said, do you understand what it's like to want or feel like you are of the opposite gender or opposite sex? And they said, no, I have no idea what that feels like. And that's inherently different than being white or being black. They are not all one and the same, but they have common goals and they've grouped together because largely there's not enough of them that they should be separated. Because here's the deal, if you're in a school today that has 1,000 people, only 3 of you are transgender.
On average.
On average. That's hardly a support system for someone who's discriminated against and bullied.
If it's high school, that's less than 1 per grade.
Right. So that's all I wanted to say about when we talk about acceptance and support and understanding. The second thing I want to talk about is KrazyReader said, well, do you think that race is a social construct? And do you think we should accept people who identify as a different race? And my answer then would be, well, it's at the very least a social construct. It may be more than that, but at the very least it's a social construct, and we see that today in our society, socially. And that particular question about how someone identifies as another race would also be a social construct question, because we're talking about whether or not we're accepting them socially. So yes, it is at least a social construct, but what I would ask KrazyReader is, or I would state is, we're looking at this backwards, right? So it's a social construct only because, well, there's a couple of reasons, but at least majority of the time in our society today, because we view people differently and we can't help but treat them differently. There's no reason to treat them differently.
Right.
That's a black person who has the same wants, needs that we have. We live in a society that says everyone deserves the same things, but it turns out in our society we don't practice that. If we don't have the Civil Rights Act of 1964, black people are treated differently. People of different religions are treated differently. People of different sexes are treated differently. People of different national origins are treated differently. Because we always just draw these lines in the sand, and I say, I am me, and this guy, who's a lot like me, is we, and you are somebody else. That's why we have countries. That's why we have borders. Because we have an innate inability to say we don't need these social classifications, and we create them on our own. And so if we got rid of that, and someone said to me, I feel like I'm a different race. I identify as a different race. My first question would be, what does that even mean? What does it mean to identify as a different race? Because when we're talking about different race, we're typically either talking about skin color or we're talking about culture. And if their skin color looks a certain way, I'm liable to believe them at that point. Why would I argue with that?
Right.
And if it doesn't, and they're culturally demonstrating what another culture would do, I would say
maybe they were adopted.
Maybe they were adopted. Maybe they just like the culture. That's okay. Yeah. So if you said, listen, I identify as a different race, I would say, what does that mean? If they say, well, I appreciate its culture, I'd say, you can appreciate its culture. You're probably using the term identify wrong, right? Maybe you don't identify as, you identify with. But, I mean, at that point, we're talking about a very minute group of people, and I would have to do more research to tell you how I really feel about it.
Sure.
But the whole point is, when we're talking about social structure, is this idea of different races doesn't make a lot of sense. It only makes sense maybe on a medical, a biological, and maybe academic level when we're talking about cultures, how they rose up, what that means, who were the primary players in the cultures, that kind of thing. So that is my simple answer. I just want to make sure I address those two things because we talked about it, and I don't want you to think we're avoiding it. But if we really wanted to get into it, we'd have a separate, full throttle discussion about it. But I did think about it. I want to get that out there.
So for me, I wanted to kind of address a couple things, kind of maybe clear up a couple issues that have been brought up that a lot of people think. First of all, one of the biggest sort of pervasive ideas that we hear here is that transgenderism is a mental illness, it's a mental disorder,
Yes.
And that comes with certain stigma, it comes with certain people believing that it's the cause of suicide. And I want to be clear, I know at one point it certainly at least was, I know we've gone through different classifications, from the APA. This is very key. From the APA.
Who's that?
The American Psychological Association.
Sounds like a body.
It does. This is an authoritative body of psychologists who discuss these things, who practice, who study all of this stuff. And it's important to look at them specifically because they are the ones who classified this as gender identity disorder. Various other classifications that it was. So people look at them and they say, all right, they're the authority. It's an identity. It's a disorder. So we need to talk about it like it is. So I think it's interesting. We need to look at what they actually say. And if you go to the APA site, and we'll provide links for this, is being transgender a mental disorder? According to the APA, people who experience intense, persistent gender incongruence can be given the diagnosis of gender dysphoria. They go on to say, a psychological state is considered a mental disorder only if it causes significant distress or disability. Many transgender people do not experience their gender as distressing or disabling, which implies that identifying as transgender does not constitute a mental disorder. For those individuals, the significant problem is finding affordable resources and the social support necessary to freely express their gender identity and minimize discrimination. So they lack the social support. What do they lack?
The social support.
The social support that does what? It minimizes discrimination. One more time for the cheap seats. It minimizes discrimination.
Oh.
Okay. So, and it goes on, again, there's, Ben Shapiro talks about, he talks about the transgender children as well, and saying that he implies that the practice or what is being prescribed is throw hormones at them, cut off their dicks, do all this stuff. Like that is like if you were to listen to Ben Shapiro, that's what you would think.
Yes.
That is not what the APA suggests at all. The APA says parents of gender non-conforming children may need to work with schools and other institutions to address their children's particular needs and ensure their children's safety. It is helpful to consult with mental health and medical professionals familiar with gender issues in children to decide how to best address these concerns. What that means is that every child is different. It's almost as though the body of scientists, the body of doctors who study the mind, think about what they're saying.
So let me ask you a question then. If you have a parent who wants to give their child hormone therapy, and hasn't discussed it with a mental health official, is that parents being a good parent?
No.
Oh, so even though parents do these things, they're not necessarily being good parents, and that's not necessarily something that should be prescribed.
Absolutely. As it turns out, any medical decision, you should consult with a doctor in that field.
Okay, what about when politicians try to make policy? Does that fit that criteria?
It doesn't. Politicians have a wealth of resources at their fingers, and they choose, much like Ben Shapiro, to ignore enormous amounts of context to fit their own agenda. So they get votes, so they get popular. And lastly, I want to talk about here, one of the things people say a lot is, these people are sick. And you know what? The Williams Institute study is a great starting point. It really is, because even if we take the considerations of inflated statistics, all these things, we can take that into account and we can still see that these numbers are too high. This is alarming. But we can't take it as gospel. We cannot take this as fact. We can say this is a great place to start and we need more research. And I think that's largely what the Williams Institute study says.
They say that at the end, by the way.
That's great.
You have to read all the way to the end.
Hell, it's a long study. I don't know. What people say is, you know what? We know there's a problem because there's this increased rate of suicide. These people need treatment. They need help. So I want to point this out. They trust the APA to say there's an issue. They trust the transgender people who self-report saying there's an issue. Now, we've talked about this before. They don't trust the transgender people to say why.
That's correct.
So what about treatment? What does the APA say for what is treatment or what you should do?
Oh, I have no idea. Please tell us all.
Let's find out. They say psychologists are encouraged to display TGNC, transgender or gender nonconforming, it's the acronym, TGNC affirmative resources and waiting areas to avoid the display of items that reflect anti-trans attitudes. Psychologists are encouraged to examine how their language, for instance, the use of incorrect pronouns and names, may reinforce the gender binary in overt or subtle and unintentional ways. It may be helpful for psychologists to provide training for support staff on how to respectfully interact with TGNC people. A psychologist may consider making changes to paperwork, forms, or outreach materials to ensure that these materials are more inclusive of TGNC people. The APA recommends you don't be a massive asshole. They recommend that you actually treat these people with respect and use the names and the pronouns they prefer. So if you want to trust the APA that there's something different, and you want to trust trans people when they say we commit suicide at a higher rate, you should also trust trans people when they say why, and the APA when they say how.
Amen. I'm just going to final that with cheers, my friend.
Cheers.
All right.
There is one more.
Oh, tell me more.
Just a little bit more here.
Tell me more.
Again, this pervasive notion from Ben Shapiro, people like KrazyReader, they say, I don't want you to dictate to me. I will not be dictated to. I'm just going to point out, if you didn't know that my name was Ryan, my name's Ryan.
It is.
So if I introduced myself to you and I said, hey, my name's Ryan, what would you call me?
I'd call you Ryan.
Yeah, it's because I dictated to you what you'd call me. If I showed up looking like this, with a reasonable beard and bald head and looking like a dude, and I said, hey, my name is Ryan, and my friends referred to me as him, would you call me him?
I would.
It's because they dictated to you. Now, if you're in an email, if you're writing an email back and forth and the person's name is Pat, and let's say you accidentally call him, it's a him, you call him a her, and someone that on the email train is like, hey, no, it's a him. What would you do? Would you call him a him?
I would.
It's because they dictated to you what to call them. So this whole thing is ridiculous because I'm not going to let you dictate to me. What that says is I'm going to treat you differently than I treat everyone else.
That's right.
We dictate all the time. And you know what? Even though my name is Ryan, if I went up to you and you hadn't met me and you hadn't watched this because we're not super popular, and you said, and I said, my name is Jason. Would you call me Jason?
I would.
Even though my name's actually Ryan?
I'm not going to let you dictate to me, even though I let you dictate to me all the time.
Oh shit, Chris. Yeah. Thanks for watching. We actually want to thank KrazyReader for corresponding. Seriously, check out the links. Check out the last video. It's a long email. When I say email, I mean comments chain.
And I don't think KrazyReader subscribed or liked, so let's get on that.
Yeah. I don't even know that KrazyReader's a fan, but we think it's important to discuss issues that people think are important.
Yeah, I don't care if they're a fan. They should like and subscribe.
That's true. Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, just like KrazyReader.
That's right. Follow our podcast.
That's right. We're on SoundCloud,
Instagram, Facebook.
YouTube, clearly.
We're working on iTunes. Stay tuned.
Yeah.
Stay eyed. All right.
And until then, it's just beer.
And politics.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Nailed it.